Hey there, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going beyond finders keepers and diving into the philosophy of property and ownership. I've got to be honest, even for someone who loves a good thought experiment, this topic initially struck me as a bit dry. But once I started digging into these Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy excerpts you sent over, I realized just how much we take for granted about something as basic as property.
It's true. Property is so deeply ingrained in our lives that we rarely stop to question its origins, justifications, or even what it truly means.
Okay, so let's start with that. What actually is property? I mean, I know it's my phone, my comfy chair, my half-eaten bag of chips, but is there a bigger idea here?
Absolutely. Philosophically speaking, property is more than just a collection of stuff. It's really a set of rules that govern how we access and control resources. And those resources can be tangible things like land goods or even your comfy chair, but also intangible things like ideas and intellectual creations.
So property is less about the stuff itself and more about who gets to decide what happens to it.
Precisely. And these rules are essential for a functioning society. Think about it. Property rules help us avoid conflict, cooperate with each other, produce goods and services, and exchange them in a way that's ideally fair and beneficial. Imagine a world with no rules about who owns what chaos.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that would get messy fast. So are all property rules the same? Or are there different ways to think about who controls what?
There are definitely different flavors of property. We can broadly categorize them into three main types: common property, collective property, and private
All
property.
right, let's break those down. Common property. That sounds like something everyone shares.
Exactly. Think of a public park. It's a resource available to everyone, but there are still rules in place to ensure its fair use and upkeep. No littering, no chopping down the trees for firewood, you get the idea. It's about balancing individual use with the collective good.
Got it. So it's shared but regulated. What about collective property?
Collective property is owned and controlled by the community as a whole, typically through some form of government or organized group. A military base is a good example. Or perhaps a community-owned forest where decisions about logging are made collectively.
Okay, so it's not just one person calling the shots.
Yes.
And then there's private property, which is what usually comes to mind when we hear the word ownership. My house, my car, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Private property is all about assigning decision-making authority over a specific resource to a particular individual, family, or corporation. They have the right to use it, exclude others from using it, and even transfer ownership to someone else. It's this power to exclude that really distinguishes private property from other forms.
But doesn't that right to exclude have some potentially problematic implications? It seems like it could easily lead to inequality and even exploitation. I mean, if someone owns all the land and resources, doesn't that give them a huge amount of power over those who don't?
That's a really important point, and gets right to the heart of the ethical debates surrounding private property. The power to exclude is indeed a double-edged sword. While it can incentivize investment and responsible use, as we'll discuss later, it can also create and perpetuate social and economic disparities.
This is making me think about my stuff in a whole new way.
Hmm.
So if private property is all about the right to exclude, what else defines it?
Well, that's where the concept of the bundle of rights comes into play. It's not just a single right to exclude, but a collection of rights and powers that can be transferred or divided.
Give me an example of how this bundle works.
Sure. Imagine you own a house. You can live in it, rent it out, sell it, even destroy it, within legal limits, of course. You can also divide those rights. Maybe you grant someone a right of way to cross your property. Or you lease the land to a farmer while retaining ownership. The bundle isn't fixed. It can be reconfigured depending on the specific context.
Okay, so it's more nuanced than just saying, this is mine, keep out. It's like a whole toolkit of options and permissions that you can use or transfer. This all seems pretty straightforward so far. So why do philosophers find property so fascinating? Why is it a topic worthy of deep dives in philosophical debate?
Well, it may seem mundane on the surface, but property is intertwined with some of the most fundamental questions in philosophy. For example, how do we distribute resources fairly? How do we balance individual freedom with the needs of the community? What is the nature of the self and its relationship to the things we own? These are all questions that philosophers grapple with.
You're right. The more we dig into this, the less simple it seems. So how do philosophers try to explain the origins of private property? Were there any eureka moments?
No single eureka moment. But there are some really interesting stories, or genealogies, as philosophers call them. These are thought experiments that try to trace how private property might have emerged in a world without it.
For like a philosophical once upon a time there was no property kind of story.
Exactly. One famous example is the Locking story, based on the ideas of John Locke. It starts with a state of nature where resources are unowned. Individuals driven by the need to survive begin appropriating these resources by mixing their labor with them. For example, cultivating land or building a shelter.
So by putting in the work, you make it yours.
That's the basic idea. Locke emphasized the moral significance of labor, arguing that individuals deserve to own what they create through their effort. Of course, there are limits to how much one person can rightfully appropriate, and Locke believed there should be enough left for others.
That makes sense. But what about simply finding something unclaimed? Doesn't that give you a right to it?
That's the first occupancy theory, the idea that the first person to use a resource has a claim to it. Locke combined this with his labor theory, arguing that productive use, not just mere possession, was key to establishing rightful ownership.
Interesting. Are there any other origin stories? It seems like a pretty big leap to go from finding a berry bush to claiming ownership of land or resources.
There are indeed other perspectives. David Hume, for example, offered a contrasting view focusing on the role of convention. His story begins in a chaotic world of constant conflict over scarce resources. Eventually, people realize it's in everyone's best interest to establish stable rules for possession. It's less about inherent rights and more about pragmatism, finding a way to live together peacefully.
So property emerges as a kind of social agreement, a way to avoid endless squabbling.
Exactly. This convention, if it holds gradually, solidifies into established property rights. And these rights become self-perpetuating as people pass on their possessions, and the system gains legitimacy over time.
Okay, so we've got a story based on labor and moral desert, and another based on social agreement and practicality. Are there any other major perspectives on how private property came about?
There's one more significant approach. Associated with thinkers like Rousseau and Kant, where property rights are ultimately grounded in social consent. Imagine a group of individuals coming together and realizing that a stable system of property requires collective agreement. They create a social contract to define and enforce these rights.
So it's not just about individual claims, but about what the community deems just and fair.
Precisely. This view opens the door to various distributive principles like egalitarianism or utilitarianism, where property rights are shaped by considerations of social good and communal well-being rather than just individual acquisition.
Wow, so we've got Locke, Hume, Rousseau, and Kant all weighing in on this. It's amazing how many different ways there are to think about the origins of something as seemingly simple as property.
Yeah.
Are these stories meant to be historically accurate, or are they more like philosophical tools for exploring different ideas?
That's a great question, and one that philosophers continue to debate. Some see these genealogies as potential explanations for how things could have happened, even if not precisely historically accurate. Others use them to highlight specific features of property or critique existing systems by imagining alternative origins.
So it's less about proving a point and more about opening up new ways of thinking about property.
Exactly. These genealogies provide different lenses through which we can examine the values, assumptions, and potential consequences of different approaches to property. And that leads us to the big question. Once we understand how private property might have emerged, how do we justify it? Is it inherently a good or bad system?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? We've covered a lot of ground already, but it feels like we're just getting started.
We are. Join us next time as we dive into the various arguments for and against private property, exploring the ethical, economic, and social implications of this fundamental aspect of human society.
Can't wait. Until then, keep those mental gears turning, everyone. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Last time we explored different ways of thinking about property and even delved into those fascinating origin stories about how private property might have emerged. But now I'm really curious about how philosophers actually justify it. Is private property inherently a good thing, or does it create more problems than it solves?
That's the core of the debate, isn't it? And there's no simple answer. Philosophers have developed a whole range of arguments for and against private property, often appealing to different values and principles.
Okay, so where do we even begin to unpack all of that? What are some of the main lines of reasoning that philosophers use to defend or critique private property?
Well, one common way to categorize these arguments is to distinguish between consequentialist and liberty-based approaches. Consequentialists focus on the outcomes. Does private property lead to a better world for individuals and society as a whole?
So it's all about the results. Like, does it create more wealth, reduce poverty, or promote overall happiness?
Exactly. One of the classic consequentialist arguments in favor of private property is the tragedy of the commons. Remember our example of the public park. If everyone has unlimited access to a shared resource, it can be overused and depleted because no one feels individually responsible for its long-term well-being.
Right. It's like the someone else will take care of it
Mm.
mentality. Or maybe if I don't take it, someone else will.
Precisely. Private property, the argument goes, incentivizes responsible use. If you own a piece of land, you're more likely to invest in it, care for it, and make sure it remains productive because you directly benefit from its long-term sustainability.
Okay, that makes sense. But couldn't you achieve the same outcome with collective ownership and a set of rules for how the resource is used, like a community agreeing on sustainable fishing practices or government managing a forest for both timber and ecological health?
That's a great point. And it highlights the fact that the tragedy of the commons isn't inevitable. There are certainly examples of communities successfully managing shared resources without private ownership. But proponents of private property often argue that it provides a more reliable and efficient way to allocate resources.
Because it taps into individual self-interest.
Exactly. And this is where the argument for markets comes into play. Consequentialists often favor private property because it underpins a market economy, which they believe is the best system for generating wealth and distributing resources efficiently.
Okay, so walk me through that connection. How does private property lead to a thriving market economy?
Well, in a market system, individuals and firms are free to buy, sell, and trade goods and services based on price signals. This creates a decentralized system where resources are allocated according to supply and demand, driven by the self-interested actions of countless individuals.
And this is supposed to be more efficient than, say, a government trying to centrally plan the economy.
That's the argument. Proponents of free markets argue that central planning is too rigid and often fails to accurately reflect the complex and constantly changing needs and desires of individuals. They point to the historical failures of planned economies, which often led to shortages, inefficiencies, and a lack of innovation.
So private property fuels the engine of capitalism, which then generates wealth and prosperity for everyone. Is that the gist of it?
That's the ideal. But it's important to acknowledge that a purely consequentialist justification of private property can't ignore the potential downsides, especially the problem of inequality. If a system generates massive wealth for a few while leaving many others struggling to meet their basic needs, can we really call it a success?
Right? Even if the pie gets bigger overall, if only a handful of people are feasting while others are left with crumbs, that's not exactly a recipe for social harmony. So do consequentialists have a response to that?
They do. Some argue that even the poorest in a capitalist society are better off than they would be under alternative systems. They point to the benefits of economic growth, job creation, and innovation that flow from a market economy. The idea is that a rising tide lifts all boats, even if some boats are bigger and more seaworthy than others.
Okay, but is that always true? I mean, economic growth doesn't always translate to a better quality of life for everyone. And what about things like environmental damage or worker exploitation that can come with unchecked capitalism? Aren't those costs that need to be weighed against the potential benefits?
Absolutely. And that's why many philosophers find purely consequentialist justifications of private property incomplete. They argue that we need to consider other values like individual liberty alongside economic outcomes.
Okay, let's talk about liberty then. How does private property connect to freedom? I can kind of see how owning things could give you a sense of independence, but I'm curious to hear the philosophical argument.
Well, one key argument is that private property protects individual autonomy and independence. It carves out a sphere of personal freedom, where you can make choices about how to use and dispose of your property without interference from others, including the government.
So it's like having a little kingdom where you get to make the rules.
In a sense, yes. You're free to use your property as you see fit, whether it's planting a garden, starting a business, or simply enjoying the peace and quiet of your own home. This control over your own domain is seen as essential for individual flourishing and self-expression.
That's a compelling argument. But doesn't it depend on how property is distributed? I mean, if someone owns vast amounts of land and resources while others have nothing, doesn't that undermine freedom for those who are excluded? It seems like their choices and opportunities would be severely limited.
You're absolutely right. The connection between private property and freedom is sensitive to how property is distributed. If a small elite controls most of the resources, it can indeed create conditions of dependence and limit opportunities for those who are less well off.
So even if private property is good for individual freedom in theory, it can also create power imbalances that undermine freedom in practice.
Exactly. And this is where the debate gets really interesting. Some philosophers argue that even an unequal distribution of private property can still promote freedom in indirect ways. For example, they might point to the free market argument we discussed earlier, emphasizing the choices and opportunities that a market economy provides, even for those who don't own a lot of property.
So even if you don't own the means of production, you still have the freedom to choose which factory you want to work in.
That's one way to put it. Others argue that a diverse range of private ownership, especially in the media, is crucial for protecting freedom of expression and dissent. They worry that concentrated ownership, whether by the government or a small group of corporations, could lead to censorship and the suppression of dissenting voices.
That makes sense. It's like if there are lots of different newspapers, websites, and publishers, it's harder for any one entity to control the flow of information and ideas.
Precisely. And this highlights the complex relationship between property and liberty. It's not just about individual ownership, but also about the broader societal structures that property systems create and how they influence the distribution of power and opportunity.
This has given me a lot to think about. So we have consequentialist arguments focusing on things like prosperity and efficiency, and liberty-based arguments emphasizing individual autonomy and choice. Are there any other angles that philosophers consider when trying to justify private property?
There are. There are a couple of other fascinating perspectives that go beyond the purely economic or individualistic arguments we've discussed so far. One idea is that private property can contribute to our sense of self, our identity, and our standing within a community.
Okay, so it's not just about material benefits or even freedom,
Yeah.
but about how property shapes who we are and how we relate to others.
Exactly. Think about it. Owning a home, for instance, can provide a sense of stability, belonging, and accomplishment. It allows you to create a space that reflects your personality, your values, your aspirations. It can become an extension of yourself in a way.
I can see that. It's like your home isn't just a shelter. It's a reflection of your tastes, your memories, your life story in a way.
Precisely. And it's not just about our personal identity. Property ownership can also play a role in how we're perceived and respected within a community. It can give you a sense of responsibility, a stake in the well-being of your neighborhood or town.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about it that way before.
That's right.
But it makes sense. If you own a home or a business in a community, you're more likely to care about what happens there, to get involved in local issues, to contribute to the common good.
Exactly. But here again, we need to be mindful of the potential downsides. If property is unevenly distributed, it can create divisions and inequalities that undermine social cohesion. Imagine a community where a small elite owns most of the land and housing. While others are constantly struggling to find affordable places to live, that kind of disparity can breed resentment, instability, and conflict.
That's a really good point. It seems like the social and psychological benefits of property ownership are closely tied to how fairly and justly property is distributed. If the system is rigged to benefit a select few, it's hard to see how it could foster a strong sense of community or shared identity.
You're absolutely right. And this brings us back to those big questions about distributive justice that we touched on earlier. The ethical implications of property are complex and multifaceted. We need to weigh the potential benefits, prosperity, efficiency, freedom, identity, social recognition against the potential costs, inequality, exploitation, and social fragmentation.
This has been an incredible journey. We've gone from basic definitions to origin stories to arguments for and against private property, and even explored the psychological and social dimensions of ownership. It's amazing how much there is to think about when it comes to something as seemingly mundane as property.
That's the beauty of philosophical inquiry, isn't it? It can reveal the hidden depths and complexities of even the most everyday aspects of our lives. But as you pointed out earlier, it seems like we've only scratched the surface. Are there any other frontiers in the philosophy of property that you'd like to explore?
Definitely. We've talked about land houses and even those abstract bundles of rights, but what about intellectual property? That seems like a whole other beast. How do traditional notions of ownership apply to things like software music or even genetic code?
That's a huge question, and one that's become increasingly urgent in our digital age. The very nature of digital information makes it difficult to control access and enforce exclusivity, which are cornerstones of traditional property rights.
Right. It's like I can hold my phone in my hand and it's clearly my phone.
Yeah.
But how do you draw boundaries around a piece of software that can be copied and shared with millions of people with a few clicks?
Exactly. And this raises a whole host of ethical and legal challenges. How do we balance the rights of creators to profit from their work with the potential benefits of widespread access to knowledge and innovation? Should there be limits on how long copyright protection lasts, especially given the rapid pace of technological change? How do we prevent the monopolization of essential digital resources or data?
These are some seriously tough questions.
Yeah.
And it seems like the lines are getting even blurrier with the rise of artificial intelligence. Who owns the copyright to a work of art created by an AI? What about the data that these systems are trained on?
Those are some of the cutting-edge issues that philosophers and legal scholars are grappling with right now. And it's not just the digital realm. The ethics of land ownership are also being re-examined in light of climate change and environmental degradation. Can we justify traditional notions of absolute ownership when it comes to resources that sustain all life on Earth? How do we balance the rights of landowners with the needs of future generations?
Wow, it's like the philosophy of property is constantly evolving to keep up with the challenges of our times. This has been such a mind-expanding conversation. I feel like I have a whole new awareness of the complexities and implications of something I used to take for granted.
That's exactly what we hope to achieve with these deep dives. It's not about providing easy answers, but about prompting critical reflection and encouraging our listeners to engage with these important questions.
So as we wrap up, what's one key takeaway you'd like our listeners to ponder as they go about their day, interacting with their stuff and navigating this world of ownership?
I think the most important thing to remember is that property is not simply a natural fact, but a human construct. It's a set of rules, relationships, and social practices that we've created. And we can choose to reshape them in ways that align with our values and aspirations for a more just and sustainable future.
That's a powerful thought. So the next time I pick up my coffee mug, walk through a public park, or even browse online, I'll be seeing property in a whole new light. And perhaps with this newfound awareness, we can all play a role in creating a world where property serves not just individual interests, but also the common good.
Well said. Until next time, keep diving deep.
We keep questioning everything.